was just curious, because my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, was that like Lehman and Bear Stearns had very, very high share ownership among the senior executives, and in fact, they suffered enormous personal losses when the banks failed. And a lot of your arguments, Professor Feinberg, have been sort of the order of that your job doesn't have a lot of substantive impact, but plays an important role politically, sort of as an expression of political will, and to let steam off the populist cap. So is what you're trying to say sort of that your job is to make a lot of sound and fury and not really have a lot of substantive impact because no one really knows the relationship between executive compensation and risk-taking and the fates of companies?
Not at all. Not at all. There may be sound and fury. I take the job very seriously. I think that the substantive prescriptions and pay packages that we've determined are important for the 7 companies. I mean, they're obviously important to Citigroup and Bank of America. They race to borrow money to get out from under my prescriptions. And that's exactly the top priority. I'm asked all the time, what do I think of that? Great! That's exactly what the Congress wanted. Pay back the taxpayer, you're out. I also think, and I mentioned this, that I hope there will be some impact voluntarily on the rest of the marketplace. Now, what impact it will be, whether a particular company as opposed to another should voluntarily subscribe to the prescriptions, that's up to the company, its financial future, its culture, its leadership. I don't claim to say that one size fits all. But I don't think this is a sideshow. I don't think what I'm doing is, you know, irrelevant. I think it's very relevant. But I just want to make it very clear, my mandated ability as a czar, which is a terrible phrase. He's right, Richard. Of course he's right. I'm not a czar. What I'm trying to do is get consensual agreement under very difficult political circumstances to a result, which Congress circumscribed the power and laid out the blueprint. That's what I'm trying to do. I do not think that it is irrelevant and it's just Sturm and Drang. I'm trying to do what I've been asked to do under the law.
A couple of responses. One, as I said before, with respect to the non-financial companies, the compensation schedules prior to the imposition of these restrictions were very different from the financial companies, so it's a different ballgame. As to the Bear Stearns and Lehman Brothers, you were right. These guys were the most heavily invested, and this shows you one of the difficulties of the argument. The way in which you do this, if you're running a company, is to tell your high-risk investors, I'm going to go down if you go down. And so therefore you can trust me because I'm putting my own money beside you. It doesn't follow from that that you want to put all your money in beside them. And one of the difficulties, of course, you get with retentions is the amount of retention ratio relative to salary will differ very much by people, which is not necessarily a good thing. You'd like to have it roughly parallel. So what they did, in effect, with Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns is those guys may have taken several $100 million off the table and left several $100 million on the table. If you want to report what happens, it's misleading to say, as Lucien has said too many times without the correction, look, these guys ended up after this debacle with $200 million in the bank. Why should we have any sympathy for them? Without mentioning the other numbers, that without the debacle, they would have had $500 million in the bank and they lost $300 million in this situation. Half empty and half full are both very important considerations in this. And one of the things that's so distressing about this situation is, as best I can tell, you have pretty close to optimal compensation packages in both of these firms and still manage to get yourself into some kind of a very serious situation. And it may well be it's something that Ken can't control and it's something that I certainly can't control, which is quite simply this, is that the people matter more than the compensation packages in terms of the ways in which these things play out. And the strategies that are made suffer not only from problems of will, but also problems from sort of error and miscalculation. And if they do that, the incentive structures we're trying to create will be only a very imperfect safeguard. And going forward on the financial side, I do believe things will start to change, either through direct regulation, about which I'm most uneasy, but I even think that when people start to invest now, the nature of those contracts is not going to look at all like what they did in 2006 and 7. Somebody else?
As part of the financial regulatory reform, Congress is trying to give the Fed the power to set pay caps. Isn't that giving the Fed the power of a permanent Pay Czar? And what is your opinion on that?
I don't think that Congress is giving the Fed the power to set pay caps. I think the Fed is trying to promulgate prescriptions on pay that will be imposed on financial jurisdictions within the financial institutions within the Fed's jurisdiction. My problem with all of these prescriptions, whether it be the Fed, the SEC, the G20, the FDIC with Sheila Bair, the trouble with all of these prescriptions is that they're sort of vanilla. I mean, when you read the prescriptions, now there may be a philosophical opposition to government regulation of any type. Put that aside. I mean, that's one point. That may be a point number one by Richard, I don't know. But point number two is when I read these prescriptions in draft form, who would disagree with a prescription that says pay should be tied to performance? What does that mean? Pay should avoid excessive risk. The reason there's such interest in what I do, I think, is I take prescriptions that everybody would probably say are sort of, in absolute terms, good, and actually apply them by coming up with dollars